The gun was already on the table when Fiona Marsh walked in with her mop. She hadn't meant to be there. She was supposed to finish the East Corridor, clock out by 9, and be home in time to feed her cat. That was the plan. But the service elevator on the 43rd floor had been stuck since Tuesday, and the building supervisor had sent her up the freight stairs with a cart full of cleaning supplies and zero warning that the Alderton Group had booked the executive boardroom for a private meeting that didn't appear on any public calendar. Fiona heard the voices before she reached the door. She stopped. There were at least 8 men in that room. She could tell by the overlapping weight of them, the way different languages stacked on top of each other like sediment. Russian near the window, 2 distinct dialects of Mandarin arguing quietly near the far wall, something that sounded like Ukrainian or possibly Polish. She hadn't decided yet. And under all of it, like a current, the clipped, flat vowels of American men who were trying very hard not to sound afraid. She should have turned around. She knew that. But the door was already open 2 inches, and through that gap she could see the profile of the man at the head of the table. Beckett Harlow. She recognized him from the building directory, founder of Harlow Capital, rumored to be worth 9 figures. Definitely the kind of man who knew people who knew people. And he looked like someone had just told him the floor was about to drop out from under him. His interpreter, a thin man in a grey suit whose name Fiona didn't know, was speaking very quietly and very incorrectly. She knew it was incorrect because the man across the table, older, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, but from absolute certainty that you were the most dangerous person in any room you entered, had just said something in Russian that had nothing to do with what the grey-suited man was translating. What the silver-haired man had actually said was, "We agreed to terms. Your side has failed to honor them. This meeting is now a formality. We've already made the other arrangements." What the interpreter told Beckett Harlow was, "He says he appreciates your patience and looks forward to continued dialogue." Fiona's hand tightened on the mop handle. The silver-haired man's name, she would learn later, was Gregor Vassin. He controlled 6 shipping routes across the North Atlantic and had been under federal investigation 3 times without a single charge sticking. The 2 men flanking him, one enormous and silent, one slight and watchful with eyes that moved constantly around the room, were not his assistants. Everyone in that room understood what they were. Everyone except, apparently, Beckett Harlow's interpreter, who was now nodding along pleasantly while Vassin said something in Mandarin to one of the men by the window. What Vassin said in Mandarin, the American doesn't understand a word. "Tell Chen to be ready." What the interpreter did? Nothing. It was becoming clear. Did anyone on Beckett Harlow's side of the table? Fiona counted 7 men flanking Harlow. She'd seen them come up in the elevator earlier that evening. She'd been polishing the brass panel near the door, and she'd overheard one of them call the others interpreters. 7 of them, and still. She looked at the gun on the table. It was sitting next to Vassin's water glass like it was a pen he'd set down. Later, people would ask Fiona why she walked in. She never had a clean answer. It wasn't bravery, exactly. It wasn't stupidity either, though she would be the first to admit it probably looked like that from the outside. It was more that she'd spent 31 years being the kind of woman that people looked through, and she'd learned that invisibility had its uses. A heavyset woman in a cleaning uniform pushing a supply cart was not a threat. She was furniture. She was background. She pushed the door open with her cart and walked in like she belonged there. For exactly 4 seconds, nobody said anything. Then the enormous silent man took a step toward her, and Vassin held up one finger, just one, barely a movement, and the man stopped. Vassin looked at Fiona. She looked at Vassin. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said in Russian with a Moscow accent she'd been told was indistinguishable from native. "I was told the room needed servicing before 10. The quality of silence in a room can change completely in under a second. This one did." Vassin's expression didn't shift much. Men like him had iron in their faces, but something behind his eyes moved. He said, In Russian? A little, she said, also in Russian. Beckett Harlow was staring at her. His 7 interpreters were staring at her. The slight, watchful man near the wall had gone very still. Vasin switched to Ukrainian. He said, "Who sent you?" "Building management," Fiona said. "In Ukrainian?" "I have a work order." She didn't, but she did have a cart full of cleaning supplies, which was close enough. Vasin studied her for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he switched again. Mandarin this time, one of the northern dialects, fast and clipped, and said something to the man he'd called Chen earlier. Chen's eyes moved from Vasin to Fiona. Fiona was already looking at Chen. She said in the same dialect, "He's asking if you know who I am. You don't. Neither does he. That's the only reason I'm still standing." Chen blinked. It was the first unrehearsed thing anyone on Vasin's side had done all evening. Vasin leaned back in his chair. He was smiling now, very slightly. "Interesting," he said in English. Beckett Harlow had been watching all of this with the expression of a man watching a card trick he couldn't follow. He was 38, Fiona knew from the building directory, with the kind of bone structure that made him look like someone central casting had sent over for the role of young titan of industry. He also had, at this particular moment, the look of someone who was beginning to realize that the meeting he thought he was in was not the meeting that was actually happening. He said, quietly. "What did he say? What did she say?" His lead interpreter opened his mouth. "Don't," Fiona said. Everyone looked at her. "He doesn't know," she said, still addressing Harlow, but not taking her eyes off Vasin. "He didn't catch any of it. None of them did." She let that land. "Do you want to know what Mr. Vasin actually said when he arrived?" A muscle in Harlow's jaw moved. "Tell me," he said. The meeting was a formality. He said, and I'm translating precisely here, that the other arrangements have already been made. That was 40 minutes ago. The room was absolutely silent. Vasin was watching her with something that had moved past curiosity into something more focused and more dangerous. "You work in this building," he said, in English now, each word deliberate. "As a cleaning woman." "Yes, and you speak 8?" she said. "Enough to be useful." Harlow's lead interpreter stood up. "Now, just a moment, she's a..." He looked at Fiona, at her uniform, at the mop still in her hand, and seemed to run out of words. "She's the only person in this room who's been telling you the truth," Harlow said. He wasn't looking at his interpreter. He was looking at Fiona. "Sit down, Gerald." Gerald sat down. Vasin made a short sound that might have been amusement. He said in Russian to the man on his left, "She's either the most dangerous plant I've ever seen, or she is exactly what she says she is." Then, to Fiona, "Which is it?" "I'm a cleaning woman who made the mistake of coming up too early," she said in Russian. "But I'm here now, and it seems like you all have a problem I might be able to help with." "We don't have a problem," Vasin said. "You have a communication problem," she said, "which, given what you've actually been saying to each other for the last 40 minutes, is about to become a much larger one." Harlow said, "What have they been saying?" Fiona set her mop against the wall. She pulled her cart to one side, out of the main walkway, because she was practical even when everything around her was not. Then she pulled out the chair 2 seats down from Harlow, not his right hand, not presumptuous but visible, and sat down. She could feel Gerald's outrage like a physical heat from across the table. She didn't look at him. "The freight contract your team believes you were negotiating tonight doesn't exist anymore. Mr. Vasin's organization restructured their North Atlantic routes 8 days ago. The man your lawyers have been corresponding with, a Mr. Petrov, was removed from his position 10 days ago. Everything your side has agreed to in the last 2 weeks was agreed to with someone who no longer has authority to agree to anything." Harlow went very still. "How do you know that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question, because Mr. Vasin mentioned it to his associate 22 minutes ago in Ukrainian, and our interpreter was busy trying to look like he understood the Russian side of the conversation and missed it entirely. She said this without heat. It was simply what had happened. Harlow turned to Gerald. Vasin, across the room, said, It was the first time he'd volunteered information. "She's correct." In the atmosphere shifted, Han. Something. Harlow looked at Vasine. So what are we actually here to negotiate? That, Vasine said, is a better question than anything your people have asked all evening. He glanced at Fiona. Ask her to stay. She's already staying, Harlow said, and something in his voice had changed too, the faint edge of a man recalibrating, finding a new fixed point in a room that had been tilting under him for an hour. Fiona thought, I should have turned around at the door. She also thought, but I didn't. The next 2 hours were the strangest of her life, and her life had included a year spent teaching herself Mandarin from library books in the apartment above her mother's dry cleaning business, so the bar was not low. Vasine's people cycled through 4 languages in deliberate rotation, she realized, not because they needed to, but because it was a test. Because they'd been doing it all evening, and none of Harlow's interpreters had caught the pattern. What they were actually communicating was not always what they were saying. There was a parallel conversation running underneath the formal one, and that was the real negotiation, and it had been going very badly for Harlow's side until approximately 9:47 p.m. when Fiona Marsh sat down. She translated. She flagged discrepancies. Twice she caught what she was fairly certain were deliberate mistranslations from Chen, who she now believed was not a straightforward member of Vasine's delegation, but something more complicated, and whose loyalty she was beginning to suspect ran not to Vasine, but to someone else in the room who hadn't said much yet. That someone was a man named. She caught it from a document that slid across the table during a break, Demirev. He had said exactly 4 words all evening, and had been sitting in the chair closest to the door since they arrived. He was medium height, medium build, forgettable in the way that people are when they have worked very hard to become forgettable. And Fiona had been watching him since the first time Chen's eyes cut toward him instead of Vasine. At 10:41, during a discussion about revised root terms, Chen said something in Mandarin that Vasine clearly hadn't expected. Fiona translated it for Harlow under her breath, fast. He just offered Harlow an alternative arrangement. Not through Vasine, a side agreement. He's running a separate play. Harlow's face didn't move. Is that common? No, she said quietly. It means someone is trying to cut Vasine out of whatever this eventually becomes. Can Vasine understand what Chen just said? Not in that dialect, no. Can you tell Vasine? She paused. That's your decision, not mine. Harlow was quiet for 2 seconds. Tell him. Fiona looked at Vasine and said in Russian, carefully and precisely, the man you brought may not be working for you. The stillness that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Vasine looked at Chen. He looked at Demirev by the door. He looked back at Fiona. Say that again, he said very quietly. She said it again. What happened next happened fast. The enormous silent man moved from his position near the wall. Demirev stood up, which was the first time he had moved voluntarily all evening. Chen said something, not in Mandarin this time, in a language Fiona hadn't heard yet, and she spent a half-second identifying it as Georgian before she understood that it wasn't directed at anyone in the room. It was directed at a device she could now see in his inner jacket pocket. He's transmitting, she said, and she was already moving. Later, she would have difficulty explaining, without embarrassment, exactly what she did next. She was a 31-year-old woman who worked in building services and had never in her life been in any situation more physically confrontational than a disputed parking space. She was not trained in anything. She was carrying a bottle of industrial floor cleaner and the laminated building ID she'd clipped to her breast pocket that morning. But she was also standing between Chen and the door because she'd sat in the chair closest to the corner and he had to pass her to get to Demirev, and she made herself very heavy and very wide and very much in the way, and when he reached her, she hit him with the floor cleaner bottle. Not gracefully, not with any technique whatsoever, but with the full weight of both arms and 12 months of pushing a loaded cart across marble floors, directly in the shoulder, and he went sideways. Harlow's security, the men she'd thought were more interpreters, which she now realized was somewhat optimistic, reached Chen approximately 3 seconds later. Demirev didn't run. She'd half expected him to. Instead, he sat back down in his chair and put both hands flat on the table and said, in English very clearly, "I want to make a deal." It took another 40 minutes to unwind. She sat through most of it at the end of the table, drinking the water someone had put in front of her, watching the room reorganize itself around a new reality. Vaesin's people made calls. Harlow's security removed Chen somewhere Fiona decided she didn't want to think about. Demirev, it emerged, was not affiliated with Vaesin at all, but with a third party that had been trying to use this meeting as cover for something else entirely, and the outline of what that something else was became clearer as the hour got later and the voices in the room got quieter. She wasn't needed for most of it. Her part was largely done. She thought about her cat. Gerald came and stood near her at one point with the expression of a man who had many feelings and no useful way to express any of them. "Where did you study?" he finally asked. "I didn't," she said. "Not formally. That's not possible. My mother's dry cleaning business was in a neighborhood where nobody spoke English," she said. "I was 10. You either learn or you miss things. I didn't like missing things." Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it. "You're a good interpreter," she said, and she meant it because he probably was under normal circumstances in rooms that stayed in one language. This was a hard room. He nodded once stiffly and walked away. She didn't think he'd forgive her for a while. That was fine. It was nearly 1 in the morning when the room finally cleared. Vaesin left with most of his people. A few of Harlow's security team remained, and 2 lawyers who had appeared somewhere around 11 and had been quietly dismayed ever since. Fiona stood up to take her cart and go. "Wait," Harlow said. He was standing by the window. The city behind him was still lit, bridge lights and tower lights and the smear of headlights, 43 floors below, and he looked like someone who hadn't quite finished processing the last 4 hours of his life. "What's your name?" he said. "Your actual name, Fiona Marsh. Fiona." He said it like he was checking whether it fit. "How long have you worked in this building?" 7 years. 7 years. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a quick category for. "I've been in this building for 4 of them. I've never seen you." "That's generally the idea," she said. "People don't usually look at the cleaning crew." He was quiet for a moment. "I look tonight." She picked up her cart. "Don't go yet," he said. It came out less like an order than she expected from a man who, by all accounts, gave a lot of orders. "Please, 5 minutes." She stayed. He asked her questions. Careful ones. The kind of questions a person asks when they are trying to understand something they know they don't fully understand yet. How had she tracked Chen's deviation from Vaesin's directives? Had she suspected Demirev from the beginning or partway through? What had tipped her? She answered honestly. She was not a person who dressed things up. "Why did you tell me to tell Vaesin about Chen?" she asked. At one point, that was a significant call. "You made it fast, because you'd been accurate about everything else," he said simply. "At some point you stopped doubting your instruments." That was, she thought, a fairly precise description of what had happened. "You could have left," he said. "When you walked in and realized what kind of meeting it was, you could have turned the cart around." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. Not the answer she'd give to most people, but the real one. "Because your interpreter said the man was grateful for your patience," she said, "and I had just heard him say he'd already made other arrangements, and I have spent my entire life watching people get taken advantage of because the translation was wrong. I didn't want to watch another one." Harlow looked at her for a long time. "Fiona Marsh," he said. "Yes, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to hear it the way it's intended and not the way it might sound." She waited. "I would like to offer you a position," he said. "Not the one you have. Something different. I don't know exactly what to call it yet because I've never needed it before, but tonight made clear to me that I need it. Someone who—" He stopped. Started again. "What happened in this room tonight could have cost me everything. Everything I've built for 14 years. Because nobody in my organization understood what was actually being said. I'm aware of what almost happened," she said. "Would you consider it?" A different role. We'd have to discuss what that looks like. The compensation would be. I'd want to know the role first, she said, before we talk about compensation. He looked at her like that was the correct answer. Fair. And I'd want it in writing. All of it. And I'd want it understood, she said, that I'm not an interpreter. I can translate language, but that's the surface layer. What I actually do is track the gap between what people say and what they mean. That's a different skill. It should be treated as one. Harlow was quiet. That's what I want understood, she said. If you're going to bring me into rooms like this one, I need to be able to function in them. You didn't stand in the corner tonight. No, she said. I sat at the table and it helped. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then she shook it. His grip was firm. Hers was too, because of the cart, because of the mop, because of 7 years and 12 months learning Mandarin in an apartment that smelled like chemical solvent, and because of every room she'd ever stood outside of and understood perfectly and walked away from. Not tonight. Monday, he said. Come to the 38th floor. Ask for Yates. I'll have something drafted by then. I work until 6 on Mondays, she said. Something moved in his expression. Not pity, exactly. More like the particular awareness that comes when you realize the coordinates of someone else's world are different from what you assumed. We can do 6:30, he said. 7, if you need it. 6:30 is fine, she said. She took her cart and her mop and the industrial floor cleaner with the dented cap, and she went back to the service corridor and down the freight stairs and out through the basement exit to the street. The night air was cold and smelled like exhaust, and the river, and the particular sharpness of a city that doesn't stop. She stood there for a minute with her cart beside her, watching a cab turn the corner 2 blocks away, thinking about her cat and her mother's dry cleaning business and a library in a neighborhood where nobody spoke English, and a 10-year-old girl who hadn't liked missing things. She still didn't. She pushed the cart to the service bay, clocked out at 1:14 a.m., and walked to the subway. On the train, a man in a suit was reading something on his phone with the focused intensity of someone receiving bad news, and she caught, from the reflection in the window, the headline of an article about the Alderton Group and a collapsed North Atlantic freight deal. She looked away. She fed her cat. She made tea. She sat at the small table in her kitchen, where she kept the library books she was still making her way through, currently a grammar text in Georgian, and she read for 20 minutes before she went to bed. On Monday at 6:30, she took the elevator to the 38th floor and asked for Yates, and the rest of it, the part that came after, was something nobody in that building, or that boardroom, or that world, had seen coming, least of all the people who had looked right through her for 7 years.